America's suicide mission, boots on the ground in Iran. Flint West reporting. Section 1. Let us begin with a simple observation. This is the kind of war that flatters air power, seduces politicians, and then humiliates them on the ground. America can bomb, Israel can bomb. They can dominate the skies, eliminate commanders, shatter launch sites, and turn infrastructure into smoke. But the real question is not whether they can punish Iran. The real question is whether they can finish Iran, and that is where the entire situation turns dark. Because the deeper truth is this: if Washington wants something, it can honestly call victory. Permanently neutralizing the nuclear threat, truly degrading missile capacity, or forcing a political end state it can live with, then air superiority is not the same thing as strategic finality. That is the trap. Iran's nuclear problem is not simply a matter of buildings that can be photographed and cratered. The International Atomic Energy Agency has reported that Iran possesses more than 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. If enriched further, that quantity could be sufficient for multiple nuclear weapons. Significant portions of that material are believed to remain in hardened tunnel complexes, such as the facilities near Isfahan. Sites that appear to have survived large parts of the bombing campaign. Inspectors have not regained access to these facilities. Verification remains incomplete, and that leaves a dangerous possibility. The visible targets may be destroyed, but the decisive material may still remain underground, unseen, unresolved. That is how wars become endless. The enemy's center of gravity survives below the rubble. Section 2. So the pinpoint position is brutal in its simplicity. If the mission is real dismantlement, someone eventually has to go and physically control the problem. Someone has to secure sites. Someone has to verify what survived. Someone has to locate what was moved. Someone has to seize what can still be weaponized. And someone has to destroy what cannot be removed. That is what boots on the ground means in this context. Not symbolism, not bravado. Not armored vehicles rolling across a screen for television. It means converting an air campaign into physical control over hardened, ambiguous, dangerous terrain. Once that reality is acknowledged, the entire slogan collapses into something much more serious. This is no longer a strike package. It becomes occupation logic, whether temporary or extended. And that is precisely the step Washington does not want to take. Publicly, leadership has signaled reluctance to authorize a ground mission. Even as internal discussions have reportedly examined options for securing enriched uranium if Iran's defenses weaken. Why the hesitation? Because everyone in Washington understands what the phrase boots on the ground in Iran actually means. Iran is not a clean target set. It is a large state, a difficult state, a country with hardened infrastructure, armed networks, regional partners, and the capacity to stretch a conflict outward. The first phase of this war has already been enormously expensive. Billions of dollars spent in the opening days, energy markets reacting violently, oil prices surging, casualties already reported. And that is before any large-scale ground force even enters the picture. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 3. Now add the political layer. Intelligence reporting indicates that Iran's government is not at imminent risk of collapse. This assessment remains even after nearly 2 weeks of sustained United States and Israeli bombardment, even after the killing of the supreme leader, even after the targeting of command structures and military infrastructure. Reports indicate that the system itself remains intact. Israeli leadership has acknowledged uncertainty about regime collapse. Prime Minister Netanyahu has publicly stated that any real regime change would ultimately have to come from within Iran. That matters, because it removes the central fantasy that often surrounds modern air wars. The idea that decapitation strikes alone can topple a state. The intelligence picture suggests something very different. The regime may be damaged, but damage is not the same as dissolution. And that leaves Washington facing a narrowing set of choices. If the campaign stops short, critical elements of Iran's nuclear program may survive. Enriched uranium may remain, command networks may endure, and the regime itself may rebuild and adapt. Over time, it could claim endurance as victory. But if escalation continues toward the level required for decisive dismantlement, the conflict moves into a far more dangerous category. A war that expands because the initial campaign solved enough to be costly, but not enough to be final. That is the historical pattern of prolonged conflict. That is the danger embedded in this moment. This is why the situation has been described as a suicide mission. Not because military power is absent, but because the path to a credible victory may demand exactly the kind of escalation that destroys the political coalition, the treasury, and the narrative of control required to sustain the war itself. And the region is already signaling what comes next. Section 4. Iran's Shiite allies have increased their activity across the region. Militant groups in Lebanon and Iraq have stepped up attacks on United States and Israeli positions. The conflict has already begun to stretch outward, toward Lebanon, toward Iraq, toward Gulf energy infrastructure, toward global shipping routes. This is not a contained duel. It is a networked conflict. Every additional day expands the perimeter. More retaliation, more pressure on shipping lanes, more strain on allied governments, more volatility in global markets, more opportunities for Iran to turn endurance itself into a strategic weapon. In that environment, the assumption that one more wave of strikes will produce strategic closure becomes increasingly fragile. It may simply produce another ring outward in the blast radius. And that is why the coalition picture matters. Publicly, there is no visible rush of allied governments preparing for a ground invasion of Iran. Instead, there is hesitation, diplomacy, sanctions disputes, United Nations debates, governments attempting to contain the conflict rather than expand it. Some states call for de-escalation, others attempt mediation. Still others remain deliberately ambiguous. What is visible is not a unified expeditionary coalition preparing to march into Tehran. What is visible is a collection of governments attempting to avoid being drawn into a war whose costs are already becoming visible. And that leads to the final contextual framework. Air power provides leverage, but not resolution. Underground nuclear material, incomplete inspection access, a resilient governing structure, regional proxy retaliation, and the absence of a broad international appetite for a ground campaign. All of these elements point to the same conclusion. The military requirements for decisive victory are moving in one direction. The political capacity to sustain those requirements is moving in the opposite direction. The mission becomes more demanding the deeper the campaign goes. But the coalition becomes weaker the more honestly the costs are described. This is not a stable strategy. It is a chokehold. It offers a path that might produce something resembling victory. But that path becomes more destructive the closer it is examined. And so the final observation becomes unavoidable. The map says targets. The reality says tunnels. The map says regime pressure. The reality says regime resilience. The map says coalition. The reality says isolation. And the darkest truth of all is this: the only road that even vaguely resembles decisive victory may also be the road that politically, militarily, and financially destroys the country attempting to walk it. That is why this conflict is not simply a war. It is a trap presented as optionality, a path that promises victory, but upon inspection begins to resemble national self-destruction wrapped in the language of strategy. Flint West, signing off.